The bitter wind carved through the frozen valley like the claws of an invisible predator, carrying with it the promise of another merciless night. Ice crystals danced in the pale light of the dying sun, creating a landscape that seemed hostile to all life. Krog pressed his massive frame deeper into the rocky outcropping that served as their temporary shelter, his thick brow ridge casting deep shadows over eyes that had witnessed too many harsh seasons. The alpha male of their small hunter-gatherer band flexed his powerful fingers around his stone-tipped spear, feeling the familiar weight that had kept them alive through countless dangers. His broad shoulders, sculpted by years of hunting mammoth and defending against cave bears, rose and fell with measured breaths. The scars that crisscrossed his muscular torso told stories of survival, each mark a testament to battles fought and won against the unforgiving wilderness. His jaw, heavy and pronounced like all of his kind, worked methodically as he chewed on a strip of dried meat, conserving their dwindling food supplies. Beside him, Nara stirred the dying embers of their precious fire, her weathered hands moving with the practiced precision of someone who understood that flame meant survival. The old firekeeper's face bore the deep lines of wisdom earned through decades of keeping the sacred light burning, even when hope seemed as fragile as dried grass. Her grey hair, streaked with white, hung in matted strands around shoulders that had carried the burden of preserving their most essential element for longer than any other member could remember. "The cold grows stronger," she murmured in their guttural tongue, her voice barely audible above the howling wind. "Fire spirits grow weak, need more fuel before darkness swallows us whole." Her gnarled fingers, joints swollen from years of gathering kindling in harsh conditions, carefully placed another precious piece of dried dung onto the struggling flames. Each movement was deliberate, calculated. Waste meant death in this frozen wasteland. The fire responded with a brief flare of warmth that painted their primitive faces in dancing orange light. Young Thak, barely past his naming season, huddled closer to the warmth, his lean body trembling despite the thick animal hides wrapped around his shoulders. As the band's most promising forager, his sharp eyes constantly scanned their surroundings for signs of edible plants or small game, but the frozen landscape offered little comfort. His nervous energy was palpable as he picked at the few remaining dried berries in his gathering pouch, rationing each morsel with the discipline of someone who understood starvation. His youthful face, still showing the soft features that would harden with age and experience, bore the characteristic heavy brow and robust bone structure of his people. Despite his youth, Thak had already proven his worth by discovering hidden caches of nuts and roots that had sustained them through previous harsh periods. His fingers, nimble from seasons of delicate foraging work, fidgeted with a small bone needle he had been crafting. Mira, heavy with the loss of her mate, who had fallen to a saber-tooth 3 moons ago, sat apart from the others, cradling her infant daughter close to her chest. The solitary mother's eyes held a distant sadness that seemed to mirror the desolate landscape around them. Her child, barely old enough to walk, represented both hope and burden in these unforgiving times. The infant's small hands grasped at the coarse fur of her mother's clothing, instinctively seeking warmth and comfort. Mira's own face showed the toll of single motherhood in this harsh world. Her cheekbones, prominent and angular, were more defined now from the weight loss that had followed her mate's death. Yet her arms remained strong, capable of carrying her child for endless miles when the band needed to move. Her eyes, once bright with the joy of partnership, now carried the steely resolve of a mother who would do anything to ensure her offspring's survival. At the edge of their small circle sat Grok, the wounded hunter, whose left arm hung useless at his side, a reminder of their last encounter with a pack of dire wolves. His breathing came in short, painful gasps, each inhalation a struggle against ribs that had been cracked in the same battle. Despite his injuries, his right hand never strayed far from his club, ready to defend the band even in his weakened state. But it was Shadow who commanded their attention now. The wolf dog, their most trusted companion and guardian, paced restlessly at the edge of their shelter. His thick coat, mottled grey and brown, bristled with an agitation that made the primitive hominids uneasy. Shadow had been with their band since he was a pup, saved from a pack that had abandoned him during a particularly harsh winter. Over the seasons, he had proven his worth countless times, alerting them to dangers and helping track prey across vast distances. Now something was profoundly wrong. Shadow's yellow eyes, usually calm and observant, darted repeatedly toward a distant point beyond their camp. His powerful chest rose and fell with rapid breaths that formed small clouds in the frigid air. The muscles beneath his thick fur coiled and relaxed in a rhythm that spoke of barely contained urgency. His large paws, equipped with claws that could tear through frozen earth, scratched nervously at the rocky ground. Suddenly he lifted his muzzle toward the grey sky and released a long, mournful howl that seemed to pierce the very soul of the frozen wilderness. The sound carried across the empty plains like an ancient song of grief, rising and falling with haunting beauty that made the hominid's primitive hearts clench with unnamed emotion. "What troubles him?" Thak whispered, instinctively gripping his gathering stick tighter. His young voice cracked with the strain of speaking against the wind. Krog's heavy brow furrowed as he studied their companion's behavior. In all his seasons as the band's strongest hunter, he had learned to trust Shadow's instincts above his own. The wolf dog's alerts had saved them from cave bears lurking in seemingly safe caves, warned them of approaching rival bands seeking to claim their territory, and led them to water sources when drought threatened their very existence. Shadow howled again, longer this time, the sound carrying undertones that spoke of discovery, of something that demanded immediate attention, yet filled him with dread. His tail, usually held high with confidence, hung low between his legs as he took several hesitant steps toward a rocky formation that rose from the frozen ground like the spine of some ancient sleeping beast. Nara looked up from the fire, her ancient eyes reflecting the dancing flames and the wisdom of countless seasons. "He calls to the ancestors," she said with quiet certainty that came from decades of interpreting signs and omens. "Something waits in the stone places, something that will change our path." The wolf dog's behavior was unmistakable. He wanted them to follow, but something about his discovery filled even this fearless creature with an anxiety that made his powerful frame tremble with more than just cold. Krog rose to his full imposing height, his powerful frame casting a long shadow across their makeshift camp as the last rays of sunlight struggled through the heavy grey clouds. The alpha male's decision carried the weight of life and death for his small band, and every fibre of his being told him that Shadow's distress was not to be ignored. The wolf dog had never led them astray, and his current agitation spoke of something far more significant than mere prey or common danger. "We follow," Krog announced in his deep, rumbling voice, the words emerging as puffs of vapor in the frigid air. His massive hands gripped his stone-tipped spear with practiced ease, the weapon feeling like an extension of his own powerful limbs. The crude tool, crafted from a long branch hardened by fire and tipped with carefully knapped flint, had served him well through countless hunts and battles. Nara carefully banked the precious fire, covering the glowing coals with a mixture of ash and dried moss that would preserve the embers for their return. Her movements were deliberate and reverent, each action performed with the knowledge that losing their fire in this frozen wasteland could mean death for the entire band. She wrapped several burning brands in thick strips of hide, creating portable torches that would light their way through the gathering darkness. "The fire spirits will wait for us," she murmured, her weathered face creased with concern, "but they grow impatient when left alone too long." Thak quickly gathered his few possessions, a collection of sharp-edged stones for cutting, his bone needle, and the precious pouch containing their remaining dried berries. His youthful energy was tempered by the gravity of the situation, and he moved with the careful efficiency he had learned from seasons of foraging in dangerous territory. His lean frame, though lacking the bulk of the older hunters, possessed a wiry strength that had served him well in navigating treacherous terrain. Mira hesitated, clutching her infant daughter protectively against her chest. The baby, barely old enough to understand the cold that threatened to steal her breath, made small whimpering sounds that cut through her mother's heart, like sharpened stone. The solitary mother's eyes searched the faces of her companions, weighing the risks of staying alone against the unknown dangers that awaited them at the stone formation. "Little one cannot endure much cold," Mira said, her voice thick with worry. The infant's small face, barely visible beneath layers of soft rabbit fur, had taken on a bluish tinge that spoke of the cold's relentless assault on her tiny body. Grok, despite his wounded condition, struggled to his feet with determination that defied his obvious pain. The injured hunter's left arm hung useless at his side, but his right hand gripped his club with unwavering resolve. His breathing came in short, ragged gasps that formed small clouds of vapor, yet his eyes burned with the fierce loyalty that bound their small band together. "We stay together," he declared through gritted teeth, each word an effort that cost him precious energy. "Band survives as one or not at all." Shadow's howling had ceased, but his agitation had not diminished. The wolf dog paced in tight circles, his yellow eyes fixed on the rocky formation that loomed like a sleeping giant against the darkening sky. His thick tail, usually held high with confidence, remained tucked low between his legs, and his ears lay flat against his broad skull. Every few moments, he would take several steps toward the stone outcropping, then return to the band with obvious reluctance. Krog studied the formation that had captured Shadow's attention, his experienced hunter's eye taking in every detail of the terrain. The rocky structure rose from the frozen ground like the backbone of some ancient creature, its weathered surface carved by countless seasons of wind and ice. Natural caves and crevices dotted its face, creating a maze of shadows that could hide either shelter or danger. "Stone holds secrets," Nara observed, her ancient voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "Shadow smells something that makes his spirit restless. Not danger, something else, something that calls to the deep memories." The old firekeeper's words carried special significance, for she was the keeper not only of flame, but also of the band's collective memory. Her understanding of signs and omens had guided them through previous crises, and her interpretation of Shadow's behavior demanded careful consideration. As they prepared to leave their temporary shelter, the wind shifted direction, carrying with it a scent that made Shadow's behavior even more pronounced. The wolf dog lifted his muzzle to sample the air, his nostrils flaring as he processed information that remained hidden from his human companions. His powerful frame trembled with something that went beyond cold, a recognition that spoke to instincts older than memory. Thak, with his forager's sensitivity to environmental changes, noticed the shift as well. "Wind brings new smells," he reported, his young voice tight with concern. "Not good smells, not bad smells, different smells." The gathering darkness added urgency to their mission. In this frozen wasteland, night brought temperatures that could kill even the hardiest survivors, and predators that hunted by moonlight. Yet Shadow's continued distress suggested that whatever awaited them at the stone formation could not wait for the relative safety of daylight. Krog made his final decision with the swift certainty that had kept his band alive through countless challenges. "We go now," he commanded, his voice cutting through the wind like the blade of a well-crafted axe. "Stay close. Watch Shadows. Trust Shadows knows more than our own eyes." Mira wrapped additional furs around her infant, creating a cocoon of warmth that would protect the small life against the brutal cold. Her movements were practiced and efficient, born from months of caring for her child in harsh conditions. Despite her fears, she knew that separating from the band would mean certain death for both herself and her daughter. Nara distributed the burning torches, ensuring each member of their group carried a source of light and warmth. The flames danced wildly in the increasing wind, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow that made the frozen landscape appear alive with movement. Her weathered hands moved with the reverence of one who understood fire's sacred nature, not merely a tool for survival, but a connection to the forces that separated life from death. Shadow led the way, his powerful form cutting through the knee-deep snow with determined purpose. Each step he took toward the stone formation seemed to increase his agitation, yet he never wavered in his direction. His thick coat provided protection against the elements that his human companions lacked, but even his robust constitution showed signs of strain against the bitter cold. The rocky formation loomed larger as they approached, its weathered face revealing details that had been hidden from their distant camp. Ancient ice flows had carved deep channels in the stone, creating a complex network of passages and chambers that could shelter a dozen bands or hide unknown dangers. The wind howled through these openings, creating an eerie symphony that seemed to echo Shadow's earlier calls. As they drew closer, Thak's sharp eyes detected something that made his breath catch in his throat. "Something there," he whispered, pointing toward a dark opening near the base of the formation. Not natural shadow, something placed by hands. Krog's grip tightened on his spear as he studied the area Thak had indicated. The young forager's observation skills had saved them before, and his words carried the weight of proven reliability. Whatever Shadow had detected was about to reveal itself, and the alpha male's instincts told him that their lives were about to change forever. The object that had caught Thak's attention became clearer as their torches pushed back the encroaching darkness. Nestled against the base of the stone formation, partially concealed by a natural overhang, lay what appeared to be a carefully constructed bundle wrapped in thick animal hides. The craftsmanship was unmistakable. This was no random accumulation of debris, but something deliberately placed and protected from the elements. Shadow's agitation reached a fever pitch as they drew closer. The wolf dog's powerful frame trembled with an intensity that went far beyond the bitter cold, and his yellow eyes remained fixed on the mysterious bundle with an unwavering focus that spoke of recognition. His thick tail remained tucked between his legs, and small whimpering sounds escaped his throat, sounds that none of the band members had ever heard from their fearless companion. Krog approached with the calculated caution of a seasoned hunter, his spear held ready to strike at any perceived threat. The alpha male's massive frame moved with surprising grace across the uneven terrain, each step carefully placed to avoid loose rocks that might betray their presence to unknown dangers. His thick brow ridge cast deep shadows over eyes that missed nothing, scanning the surrounding area for signs of ambush or territorial markers left by rival bands. "Smells wrong," he growled in his deep voice, the words forming clouds of vapor that dissipated quickly in the frigid air. "Not our people, not fresh. Old smells, but—" He paused, his broad nostrils flaring as he tried to identify the complex mixture of scents that clung to the bundle. Nara raised her torch higher, allowing the dancing flames to illuminate more of the mysterious object. The old firekeeper's ancient eyes, dulled by countless seasons but sharpened by experience, studied every detail with the intensity of one who had learned to read signs that others missed. The hide wrapping was expertly worked, sewn with sinew in patterns that spoke of skilled hands and patient craftsmanship. "Stone sack," she whispered, her voice carrying a mixture of awe and apprehension. "Made to last many seasons, made to protect something precious." The bundle was roughly the size of a small child, wrapped multiple times in what appeared to be mammoth hide, bison fur, and other precious materials that represented significant wealth to any hunter-gatherer band. Bone toggles and carved antler clasps held the wrapping secure, their surfaces polished smooth by careful handling. The entire construction spoke of time, effort, and resources that no band would expend lightly. Thak crept closer, his youthful curiosity overcoming his natural caution. The young forager's sharp eyes detected details that the others might miss: the way the hide had been treated to resist moisture, the careful positioning that protected the bundle from direct exposure to wind and rain, the small stones placed strategically around its base to prevent shifting. "Much work here," he observed, his voice hushed with respect for the unknown craftsman's skill. "Many hands, many days. Someone cared much for what sleeps inside." Mira, despite her protective grip on her infant daughter, found herself drawn to the bundle with an inexplicable magnetic pull. The solitary mother's intuition, honed by the responsibilities of protecting her child, detected something in the careful wrapping that spoke to her maternal instincts. Her weathered face, marked by the hardships of recent loss, showed a complex mixture of curiosity and dread. "Feels like remembering," she murmured, her words barely audible above the wind, like something calling from deep memory dreams. Grok, despite his wounded condition, positioned himself between the bundle and the open terrain behind them, his functioning arm gripping his club with determined strength. The injured hunter's breathing came in short, painful gasps, but his eyes remained alert for any signs of danger that might threaten the band while they investigated this mysterious discovery. Shadow's behavior became even more pronounced as Krog reached toward the bundle. The wolf dog began to pace in tight circles, his movements creating small clouds of snow that glittered in the torchlight. His powerful voice released a series of short, sharp barks, followed by longer, more mournful howls that seemed to carry messages intended for ears that could no longer hear. "He knows," Nara said with quiet certainty, her ancient wisdom interpreting the animal's distress. "He smells the truth that waits inside. His spirit recognizes what our eyes cannot yet see." Krog's massive hands, scarred by countless hunts and battles, reached for the bone toggles that secured the outer wrapping. His fingers, thick and powerful enough to snap a deer's neck, moved with surprising gentleness as he began to work at the carefully crafted fastenings. Each toggle had been carved with intricate patterns that spoke of artistic skill rarely seen in their harsh world. The first layer of mammoth hide fell away, revealing another layer of softer bison fur beneath. The smell that rose from the bundle was complex, old but not rotten, preserved by the dry cold and careful preparation. There were hints of herbs and smoke, suggesting that whoever had prepared this package had taken great care to ensure its contents would survive the passage of time. As the second layer was carefully peeled back, the torchlight revealed glimpses of something that made the entire band gasp in unison. Nestled within the protective wrappings were the carefully arranged remains of what had once been a magnificent cave bear, but this was no ordinary predator. The bones had been painted with ochre and arranged with ritual precision, adorned with carved ivory ornaments and strings of polished stones that spoke of reverence and deep emotional attachment. But it was the small objects scattered throughout the arrangement that truly broke their hearts. Tiny bone carvings of animals, perfectly crafted tools scaled down to miniature size. And most heartbreaking of all, a small carved figure that unmistakably represented a young hominid child. The figure was positioned as if embracing the great bear, its small arms wrapped around what would have been the creature's massive neck. "Sacred companion," Nara breathed, her voice thick with emotion as understanding dawned. "Child spirit guide. Someone's little one loved this bear, and when death came—" She could not finish the words, but the meaning was clear to all. The cave bear had been more than a pet. It had been a beloved companion, raised from a cub and cherished as family. The careful preservation, the ritual arrangement, the precious objects buried with it all spoke of a grief so profound that an entire band had invested time and resources they could barely spare to ensure their lost member received proper honor. Shadow's howling took on a different quality now, no longer the sound of agitation but something deeper, a recognition of loss that transcended species. His powerful frame settled into a sitting position, his muzzle raised toward the star-filled sky as he sang a song of mourning that seemed to speak for all the grief the world had ever known. Mira clutched her infant daughter closer, tears freezing on her cheeks as she understood the depth of love and loss represented by this carefully preserved memorial. In this harsh world where survival demanded constant vigilance, someone had chosen to honor love over practicality, creating a shrine to the bonds that made life worth living even in the face of inevitable death. The discovery had shattered their hearts not with horror, but with the recognition of their own capacity for loss, love, and the desperate hope that those we cherish might somehow be remembered long after the cold earth claims them. The discovery of the sacred burial unleashed a torrent of suppressed memories within each member of the band, emotions that had been carefully buried beneath the necessity of survival, now surfacing like underground springs, breaking through frozen earth. The wind seemed to carry whispers of their own losses, reminding them of the fragile bonds that held their small community together against the vast indifference of the glacial world. Mira was the first to break under the weight of recognition. The solitary mother sank to her knees in the snow, her infant daughter pressed against her chest as sobs racked her powerful frame. The sight of the carefully arranged memorial had torn open wounds that she thought had scarred over, bringing back the memory of her mate's final moments when the saber-tooth's massive fangs had torn through his throat. "Jorak had bear friend too," she whispered through her tears, her voice barely audible above the mournful wind. "Little brown cub he saved from ice trap, fed it meat from his own mouth when hunger came, called it Rumble for the sounds it made when happy." Her words painted a picture of tenderness that seemed impossible in their harsh world. Yet every member of the band remembered the gentle giant who had been Mira's mate. Jorak's massive hands, capable of crushing a wolf's skull, had been infinitely patient when feeding the orphaned cub or teaching it to fish in the shallow streams that ran during the brief summer seasons. "Rumble died same day as Jorak," Mira continued, her voice growing stronger as the memories flooded back. "Tried to protect him from the great cat, small claws against death fangs. Found them together, bear cub still trying to lick wounds that would not heal." Thak's youthful face crumpled as his own buried grief surfaced. The young forager had lost his younger sister to the wasting sickness 2 seasons ago, and the sight of the child figure embracing the cave bear brought back memories he had tried desperately to forget. His sister Kira had possessed an unusual gift for befriending the small animals that lived around their camps, particularly a family of ground squirrels that she had named and fed scraps from her own meager portions. "Kira talked to tree spirits through squirrel friends," Thak said, his voice cracking with emotion. "Said they told her stories of warm places beyond the ice. When fever took her, squirrels came to her sleeping furs, stayed until her breathing stopped, buried them with her, still warm against her chest." The young man's tears fell freely now, each drop a testament to the love that survived even in this frozen wasteland where sentiment was often a luxury that meant death. His lean frame shook with the force of emotions he had suppressed in order to continue functioning as the band's primary forager. Even Krog, the mighty alpha whose strength had been their shield against countless dangers, found his own carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. The sight of such deliberate reverence in the burial arrangement reminded him of his own father, the previous leader of their band, who had died defending them from a pack of dire wolves 3 winters past. Old Krog loved Wolfdog before Shadow, he rumbled, his deep voice thick with uncharacteristic emotion. White fur, blue eyes like ice water. Called him Ghost for the way he moved silent through snow. When father fell to wolf pack, Ghost threw himself at the largest wolf, bought time for band to escape. The alpha male's massive hands clenched and unclenched as he continued, his scarred knuckles white with tension. Found Ghost later, throat torn but still breathing. Stayed with him until Spirit left for hunting grounds beyond the sky. Promised him Shadow would take his place watching over the band. Nara, keeper of their collective memory and guardian of their sacred fire, felt the weight of all their accumulated losses pressing down upon her ancient shoulders. The old woman had witnessed more grief than any living member of their kind, had seen generations of bonds form and break beneath the relentless pressure of survival. Yet the careful love demonstrated in the burial before them reminded her why their small band continued to endure. All bands carry such love, she said, her weathered voice carrying the authority of one who had learned wisdom through decades of pain. All bands know the cutting of hearts when companions pass to the far hunting grounds. This is why we honor the dead with ceremony, why we remember their names when wind howls lonely in the night. Grok, despite his wounded condition and the constant pain that gnawed at his side, found himself thinking of his own lost companion, not an animal, but his hunting partner, Brak, who had died in the same dire wolf attack that had left him crippled. The 2 men had been like brothers, sharing everything from food to the responsibility of protecting the band's younger members. Brak saved my life when wolves circled, Grok said through gritted teeth, each word an effort against the pain that threatened to overwhelm him. Threw himself between me and pack leader, fought with broken spear until they brought him down, died so wounded Hunter could live another day. His functioning hand moved to touch a small bone pendant that hung around his neck, a carved wolf tooth that had belonged to his fallen friend. Carry piece of him always. When my time comes, want this buried with me, so spirits know we hunted together in life. Shadow, their faithful wolf-dog companion, seemed to understand the grief that surrounded him. The powerful animal moved among the mourning band members, pressing his warm fur against each of them in turn, offering the wordless comfort that only a creature who had experienced loss could provide. His yellow eyes reflected an ancient sadness, as if he carried the genetic memory of every wolf and dog who had ever bonded with human companions. The sight of their devoted protector offering comfort while his own distress remained visible served to deepen their understanding of the burial they had discovered. This was not merely the grave of a pet, but a testament to the bonds that transcended species, that made survival meaningful beyond the simple continuation of breathing. As the band huddled together in the growing cold, sharing their memories of loss and love, they began to understand that they had stumbled upon something sacred, not just the burial of a beloved companion, but a reflection of their own capacity for devotion that survived even in the face of inevitable death. The unknown child who had loved the cave bear enough to ensure its proper burial had created something that spoke to the deepest parts of their primitive hearts. The wind continued to howl through the stone formation, but now it seemed to carry the voices of all those who had been loved and lost, a chorus of memory that connected them to every band that had ever grieved, ever hoped, ever dared to love, in a world that offered no guarantees beyond the certainty of eventual parting. As the emotional storm of shared memories began to subside, Krog's hunter instincts reasserted themselves, drawing his attention to details beyond the sacred burial that lay before them. The alpha male's trained eye began to notice signs that spoke of the band who had created this memorial, subtle markers that told a story of desperate love and terrible loss etched into the very landscape around the stone formation. "Look here," Krog rumbled, his deep voice cutting through the wind as he pointed to marks in the sheltered area behind the burial site. Sleeping places. Many people. Long time. The evidence was unmistakable once he had drawn their attention to it. Shallow depressions in the earth, worn smooth by repeated use, formed a semicircle around what had once been a fire pit. The arrangement spoke of a band larger than their own, perhaps 15 or 20 individuals who had made this rocky formation their home for an extended period. Scattered around the sleeping areas were the debris of daily life, discarded bone fragments from meals, worn grinding stones, and the telltale chips of flint from tool-making. "Tak," His forager's eye, trained to read the landscape like the pages of an ancient story, began to piece together the timeline of occupation. His lean frame moved carefully through the sheltered space, examining each artifact with the reverence of one who understood that these humble objects represented lives lived and lost. Not fresh, he observed, kneeling beside a collection of fire-cracked rocks that had once lined a cooking pit. But not ancient either. Maybe 2 seasons passed, maybe 3. Band stayed here through long cold, tried to wait for spring that came too late. The young man's assessment sent a chill through the group that had nothing to do with the frigid air. They all understood the implications of a band choosing to remain in one place for an entire winter. Such a decision was never made lightly. It meant either that someone in the group was too weak to travel, or that they had found something worth protecting that could not be moved. Nara, her ancient eyes scanning the area with the wisdom of countless seasons, began to identify the specific markers that spoke of prolonged habitation. The old firekeeper's understanding of how bands lived and survived allowed her to read the subtle signs that others might miss. Many fire circles, she noted, pointing to several distinct areas where ash and charcoal still stained the earth despite the passage of time. Rotated fires to save fuel, preserve warmth. Smart thinking, but desperate thinking, only done when no choice remains. Her weathered fingers traced the edge of one fire pit, feeling the careful construction that spoke of skilled hands working with limited resources, used every scrap of burning material, even burned bone when wood grew scarce. Firekeeper knew her trade but fought losing battle against endless cold. Mira, still clutching her infant daughter protectively against her chest, noticed something that made her maternal heart clench with recognition. Scattered among the adult-sized sleeping depressions were smaller hollows, clearly made by children of various ages. The sight brought back the immediate fear that haunted every parent in their harsh world, the constant threat that winter posed to the young and vulnerable. "Small ones here too," she whispered, her voice heavy with the weight of understanding. "Many small ones. Band tried to protect all, save all. But cold shows no mercy to size or age." The evidence painted a picture of a community that had been trapped by circumstances beyond their control. Perhaps the early onset of an especially brutal winter, or the injury of a crucial band member, or the discovery of a resource that seemed worth the risk of staying in one place. Whatever the reason, they had made their stand here in this sheltered spot beneath the stone formation. Grok, despite his wounded condition, had positioned himself where he could observe the approaches to their location while still participating in the investigation. The injured hunter's tactical mind, honed by years of defending against threats both human and animal, noted the defensive advantages of the site. "Good place for last stand," he said grimly, his words emerging as puffs of vapor in the cold air. "Rocks protect from wind, give shelter from above, water source nearby in warm seasons, could hold position here against many enemies." His observation carried ominous implications. If this had been a defensive position, it suggested that the lost band had faced threats that made travel impossible. Perhaps rival groups competing for scarce resources, or predators that had driven them to seek shelter in this remote location. Shadow, who had remained close to the burial throughout their investigation, suddenly became agitated again. The wolf dog's powerful nose detected scents that his human companions could not perceive, and his behavior suggested the discovery of something new. He began to pace toward a narrow passage between 2 large boulders, his yellow eyes fixed on something hidden in the shadows beyond. Following their faithful companion's lead, the band discovered additional evidence of the lost group's fate. Hidden in the passage was a cache of supplies that had been carefully sealed and concealed. Emergency provisions that spoke of planning and hope, but also of the grim reality that they might never be retrieved. The cache contained dried meat wrapped in hide, precious flint cores for toolmaking, and several carved bone implements of exceptional quality. But most telling were the personal items that had been stored with the survival supplies. A child's wooden doll, worn smooth by countless hands, and a small leather pouch containing teeth from various animals, likely the collection of a young hunter eager to prove his skills. "They plan to return," Thak said softly, his young voice filled with sadness as he examined the carefully preserved items. "Hid these treasures, thinking spring would bring them back to claim what they loved most." The discovery of the cache, combined with the evidence of extended habitation, began to tell a story that none of them wanted to fully comprehend. The lost band had not simply passed through this area. They had lived here, planned here, hoped here. They had invested time and resources in creating a home, had tried to wait out the harsh conditions that would allow them to continue their journey. But something had gone wrong. The burial of the sacred cave bear was not an isolated tragedy. It was part of a larger catastrophe that had befallen an entire community. The careful preservation of the animal, the investment of precious materials in its memorial, spoke of a people who had maintained their values and their capacity for love, even as their world collapsed around them. Nara stood slowly, her ancient joints protesting against the cold as she surveyed the full scope of their discovery. The old woman's face carried the weight of understanding that came from a lifetime of witnessing the cycles of survival and loss that defined their existence. "This place holds much grief," she said, her words carrying the authority of one who had learned to read the signs that others overlooked. Band made choice between love and survival, chose love knowing the cost. Sacred Bear was not only death here, was first death, one that broke the spirit of the people who remained. The implications of her words settled over the group like a shroud. They had not simply found a grave, they had found the remnants of a community that had valued love over survival, that had chosen to honor their bonds, even when practical wisdom dictated otherwise. It was a choice that spoke to the deepest parts of their primitive hearts, and one that would force them to confront their own values in the harsh light of reality. The weight of their discovery settled upon the small band, like the crushing pressure of glacier ice, forcing them to confront questions that went to the very heart of what it meant to be human in a world that offered no guarantees beyond suffering and death. As they huddled around the sacred burial in the growing darkness, each member wrestled with the implications of what they had found and what their response should be. Krog stood silent for long moments, his massive frame outlined against the star-filled sky, as he contemplated the choice that lay before them. The alpha male's responsibility extended beyond mere survival. He was the keeper of his band's honor, the one whose decisions would define their character for generations yet unborn. The careful love demonstrated in the cave bear's burial called to something deep within his primitive soul, demanding a response that transcended practical considerations. "Sacred companion deserves proper songs," he finally rumbled, his deep voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "Unknown child loved truly, honored the bond that makes us more than beasts. We cannot walk away from such devotion without answering its call." His words sent ripples of both fear and admiration through the group. They all understood what the alpha male was suggesting, a ritual ceremony in honor of the lost band and their beloved companion. Such ceremonies required time, energy, and resources that they could barely spare, especially with winter's grip tightening around them like the jaws of a dire wolf. Nara, keeper of their traditions and guardian of the sacred fire, felt the pull of ancient obligations that ran deeper than the need for personal survival. The old woman's weathered face reflected the dancing flames of her torch as she considered the spiritual implications of abandoning such a sacred site without proper acknowledgement. "Spirits of the lost ones walk restless here," she said, her ancient voice carrying the authority of one who had communed with forces beyond the visible world. "They wait for someone to sing their names, to carry their stories forward into memory. If we leave them silent, their grief will follow us like hunting shadows." The firekeeper's words touched upon beliefs that were fundamental to their understanding of existence. In their world, the proper honoring of the dead was not merely ceremony, it was essential maintenance of the spiritual balance that kept their community connected to the forces that governed life and death. Thak, despite his youth, felt the call of obligation as strongly as his elders. The young forager's encounter with his own grief over his sister's death had awakened him to the sacred nature of memory and the importance of ensuring that love transcended the boundaries of mortal existence. "Child who loved Bear Cub deserves remembering," he said, his voice stronger now with conviction. "Maybe if we sing proper songs, spirits can find peace. Stop calling shadow to remember pain that cannot heal." The young man's observation about their wolf dog's continued agitation added practical weight to the spiritual arguments. Shadow's distress had not diminished since their discovery of the burial. If anything, his anxiety had increased as they uncovered more evidence of the lost band's tragedy. His restless pacing and intermittent whimpering suggested that he sensed spiritual imbalances that would continue to affect them all until properly addressed. Mira, clutching her infant daughter against her chest, found herself torn between maternal protectiveness and the recognition of sacred duty. The solitary mother's recent experience with loss made her acutely aware of both the importance of honoring the dead and the terrible risks that such ceremonies could pose to the living. "Little one grows cold," she whispered, her voice thick with the agony of impossible choices. "Each moment here steals warmth from small body, brings death closer to my heart." "But," she paused, her eyes fixed on the carefully arranged burial before them. "If we teach children that love means nothing when survival calls, what kind of people do we become?" Her words crystallized the fundamental dilemma that faced them. They were not merely deciding whether to perform a ceremony. They were choosing what values would define their band, what lessons they would pass to the next generation about the meaning of loyalty and love in a world that seemed designed to punish such sentiments. Grok, despite his injured condition and the constant pain that gnawed at his strength, felt the pull of warrior honor that demanded recognition of courage wherever it was found. The wounded hunter's own recent brush with death had given him a perspective on the temporary nature of all earthly existence, making the spiritual realm seem more real and immediate than physical comfort. "Band that stayed here showed true courage," he said through gritted teeth, each word an effort against the pain that threatened to overwhelm him. "Chose love over safety, honored bonds over survival. Such courage deserves warriors' recognition, proper songs to carry their names to the far hunting grounds." His words carried special weight because they came from one who had faced death in battle and understood the price of valor. If a wounded warrior believed that honor demanded ceremony, then the obligation became even more compelling. Shadow, as if sensing the gravity of their deliberations, positioned himself directly beside the burial and released a long, mournful howl that seemed to speak for all the voiceless grief that surrounded them. His powerful voice carried across the frozen landscape like a prayer, rising and falling with haunting beauty that made their primitive hearts ache with recognition of universal loss. The wolf dog's spontaneous song seemed to tip the balance of their decision. Here was their most trusted companion, the one whose instincts had guided them safely through countless dangers, telling them in the only way he could that this moment required more than mere acknowledgement. It demanded active participation in the sacred work of remembering. Krog looked around at his small band, reading the resolution that had formed in each face despite the obvious risks. The alpha male's own heart swelled with pride at their collective courage, their willingness to choose honor over convenience even when survival hung in the balance. "We stay tonight," he announced, his voice carrying the finality of absolute command. "We build proper fire, sing songs for unknown child and sacred companion. We honor the love that makes us human, carry their memory forward so death has no final victory." The decision brought both relief and terror. They would be exposing themselves to additional hours of brutal cold, burning precious fuel for ceremonial fires, and delaying their journey to more sheltered locations. Yet each member of the band felt a lightening of spirit, as if choosing to honor the lost ones had connected them to sources of strength that transcended mere physical endurance. Nara immediately began preparing for the ceremony, her movements taking on the ritualistic precision that accompanied all sacred work. The old firekeeper understood that their choice had committed them to more than a simple acknowledgement. They would need to create a ritual worthy of the love they had discovered, one that would properly honor both the lost child and the faithful companion who had been buried with such care. "Need special fire," she announced, her weathered hands already sorting through their limited supplies of kindling. "Sacred flames to carry messages to spirit world, proper light for ceremony that will heal the restless dead." As they began their preparations, the wind seemed to quiet slightly, as if the frozen landscape itself approved of their decision. The stars above shone with unusual brightness, and even the bitter cold seemed somehow more bearable as they committed themselves to the sacred work of remembering those who had loved deeply enough to risk everything for the bonds that made survival meaningful. The preparation for the ceremony began with Nara's careful construction of a sacred fire circle, her ancient hands moving with the precision of one who had performed such rituals countless times before. The old firekeeper selected stones with particular care, arranging them in patterns that honored both the earth spirits and the sky watchers, creating a bridge between the world of the living and the realm where the dead continued their eternal hunt. "Fire speaks to spirits in language older than words," she murmured as she worked, her weathered face illuminated by the growing flames. "Sacred light carries our songs across the darkness that separates life from death, ensures that love transcends the boundaries of mortal flesh." The ceremonial fire required different materials than their simple survival flames. Nara had saved precious aromatic woods from warmer seasons, small pieces of pine and birch that would release fragrant smoke when burned. She added herbs that had been carefully dried and preserved, their sharp scents designed to attract the attention of spiritual forces and create the proper atmosphere for communication with the departed. Krog, understanding his role as the band's leader and strongest voice, began to prepare the ritual elements that would honor the fallen warrior's code. The alpha male's massive hands, more accustomed to wielding weapons than creating ceremonial objects, worked with surprising gentleness as he gathered stones and branches to create an altar worthy of the courage they were commemorating. "Unknown child showed Hunter's heart," he rumbled as he arranged river stones in a pattern that represented the eternal cycle of pursuit and rest. "Loved without counting cost, protected the weak, honored the bond that makes warriors more than killers. Such spirit deserves recognition from those who understand the weight of leadership." The alpha male's own ritual preparations included the careful placement of his finest spear points around the burial site, offering them as temporary gifts to the spirits of the lost band. These weapons represented significant value. Each point had been carefully knapped from premium flint and hafted with sinew that had been soaked and stretched to achieve maximum strength. Their temporary sacrifice demonstrated the depth of his respect for the unknown child's courage. Thak, with his forager's understanding of the natural world's hidden connections, began to gather offerings from the landscape around them. Despite the frozen conditions, his trained eye found winter berries preserved beneath ice, small stones worn smooth by ancient waters, and fragments of crystal that caught and reflected the sacred firelight. "Child loved growing things, animals that trust," he said, as he arranged his offerings in small piles around the burial. "Forager's heart sees truth. Love makes all creatures kin, breaks down walls between hunter and hunted, between strong and weak." The young man's offerings were modest but meaningful, each item selected for its symbolic value rather than material worth. A twisted root that resembled a bear in miniature, berries that remained sweet despite the killing frost, stones that sang with musical notes when struck together, all spoke to the wonder and joy that must have filled the unknown child's short life. Mira, despite her need to constantly warm her infant daughter, found ways to contribute to the ceremony that honored her own experience as a mother who had faced loss. The solitary mother unwrapped one of her most precious possessions, a soft rabbit fur that had been her mate's gift during their courtship, and placed it gently beside the cave bear's remains. "Child knew mother love, father protection," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion as she made her offering. "Sacred companion felt same care, same devotion that makes survival worth the struggle. Mother heart recognizes mother heart, even across the barrier of death." Her contribution carried special weight because it represented a sacrifice of practical value. The rabbit fur was one of the softest materials they possessed, crucial for keeping her infant warm during the brutal nights. By offering it to the ceremony, she demonstrated that some values transcended even maternal protectiveness. Grok, working through constant pain from his injuries, contributed what a warrior could give when physical strength had been compromised. The wounded hunter began to share the battle songs that honored fallen comrades, his voice carrying the ancient melodies that had been passed down through generations of fighters who understood the sacred nature of loyalty unto death. "Warrior sings for warrior," he said, his damaged voice growing stronger as the familiar rhythms took hold. "Young fighter who chose love over safety deserves songs that carry truth to the ancestors who wait in the far hunting grounds." His battle chants, normally reserved for fallen members of their own band, took on new meaning when applied to the unknown child. The words spoke of courage, tested in the crucible of impossible choices, of loyalty that persisted even when hope had died, of love that burned brighter than the fear of extinction. Shadow, their faithful wolf-dog companion, seemed to understand the sacred nature of their activities. The powerful animal positioned himself as a living guardian around the ceremony, his yellow eyes reflecting the firelight as he maintained watch against any forces that might interfere with their ritual work. His earlier agitation had transformed into a focused intensity that spoke of spiritual participation beyond mere animal instinct. As the ceremonial preparations reached completion, the wind began to shift direction, carrying their smoke and chanted words toward the star-filled sky. The aurora borealis chose that moment to dance across the northern horizon, painting the ice fields with curtains of green and blue light that seemed to acknowledge their sacred work. Nara, as the keeper of spiritual traditions, began to weave together the individual contributions into a unified ceremony that would properly honor the lost ones. Her ancient voice rose and fell in patterns that seemed to echo from the very stones around them, calling upon forces older than memory to witness their act of remembrance. "Spirits of the lost band, hear our voices carrying across the darkness," she chanted, her words forming clouds of vapor that rose like prayers toward the dancing lights above. "Unknown child who loved without limit, faithful companion who shared that love, we who walk the same difficult path offer recognition of your courage." The ceremony proper began with the telling of their own stories, each band member sharing memories of loss and love that connected them to the experiences of those they honored. These personal testimonies created a bridge of understanding across the chasm of death, acknowledging that grief and devotion were universal experiences that transcended the boundaries between different groups. Krog spoke of his father's sacrifice and the loyalty of Ghost, the white wolf dog who had died defending their band. Mira shared the story of Jorak and Rumble, the mate and bear cub who had fallen together. Thak honored his sister Kira and her beloved ground squirrels. Grok remembered his hunting partner Brak and their brotherhood forged in battle. Each story added weight to their collective understanding of why the unknown child's choice to honor their sacred companion deserved recognition. The ceremony was becoming more than a simple acknowledgement. It was evolving into a celebration of the capacity for love that made their harsh existence meaningful despite its inevitable conclusion in death. As the sacred fire burned higher and the aurora painted the sky with otherworldly beauty, the small band felt themselves connected to something larger than mere survival. They were participating in the eternal human story of love, loss, and the courage to care deeply even when caring guaranteed eventual heartbreak. As the ceremony deepened and the sacred fire burned with intensifying brilliance, something extraordinary began to happen. The wind, which had been howling relentlessly through the stone formation, suddenly stilled to an almost supernatural calm. In that profound silence, broken only by the crackling of aromatic wood and the distant call of night hunters, the band began to sense presences that existed beyond the reach of physical sight. Shadow was the first to respond to these invisible visitors. The wolf dog's powerful frame went rigid with attention, his ears pricked forward, and his yellow eyes fixed on points in the darkness where nothing visible moved. Yet his behavior suggested the presence of familiar spirits. His tail began a slow, respectful wag, and small whimpering sounds of recognition escaped his throat, as if he were greeting old friends who had returned from a long journey. Nara, whose advanced age and spiritual sensitivity made her most attuned to such phenomena, felt the subtle shift in the atmosphere that indicated their ceremony had achieved its intended purpose. The old firekeeper's weathered face reflected not fear, but profound satisfaction as she recognized the signs that the boundary between worlds had grown thin enough to allow communication. "They come," she whispered, her ancient voice filled with awe and reverence. "The lost ones answer our call, drawn by the sacred fire and the sincerity of our remembrance. The child spirit walks among us, and the sacred companion follows where love leads." The sensation was not one of haunting or supernatural terror, but rather the comforting presence of family members returning home after a long absence. Each band member felt it differently. Krog sensed the approval of a young warrior whose courage had earned respect across the barrier of death, while Mira felt the gentle touch of a child spirit grateful for maternal understanding of loss. Thak, with his forager's sensitivity to the natural world's hidden currents, began to perceive details that others might miss. The shadows cast by their firelight seemed to move independently of the flames that created them, forming shapes that suggested small figures moving at the edge of vision. The scents carried on the now gentle breeze brought hints of unfamiliar flowers and warm sunshine, as if the spirits brought memories of happier times and distant places. "They show us pictures," the young man said softly, his voice filled with wonder as his perception expanded beyond normal boundaries. "Child runs through summer meadows, small bear cub tumbling beside like playful shadow. Laughter carries on wind that smells of growing things, and hope that knew no limits." The visions that came to them through the sacred fire seemed designed to share the joy that had preceded the tragedy they had discovered. They saw flashes of a vibrant community, where children played without fear, where the bond between the young human and the bear cub had been celebrated rather than merely tolerated. The unknown child had not been alone in their love. They had belonged to a band that understood the sacred nature of cross-species friendship. Grok, despite his wounded condition and constant pain, felt his warrior's heart, responding to glimpses of the final battle that had claimed the lost band. Through the spiritual connection facilitated by their ceremony, he began to understand the courage and desperation that had marked their last stand against overwhelming odds. "Many enemies came," he said, his voice tight with the emotion of shared combat experience. "Not beasts, other bands, desperate with hunger, fighting over last good hunting grounds. Child's people chose to defend sacred places rather than abandon what they loved." The images that reached him through the spiritual connection painted a picture of terrible choices forced by desperate circumstances. The lost band had been driven to their rocky fortress not by accident, but by the pressure of hostile neighbors who sought to claim their resources. Faced with the choice between abandoning their sacred sites and fighting impossible odds, they had chosen to make their stand in defense of everything that gave their lives meaning. Mira, her maternal instincts heightened by the spiritual atmosphere, began to receive impressions of the child's final days. Through the connection established by their ceremony, she sensed the weight of decisions that no young person should have been forced to make. The terrible burden of watching beloved companions suffer when help seemed impossible to find. "Small one knew the end was coming," she whispered, tears flowing freely down her weathered cheeks. "Spent last strength preparing sacred companion for journey to far hunting grounds. Made sure love would be remembered, even when all other hope had died." The revelation struck the band with devastating force. The elaborate burial they had discovered was not the work of surviving adults honoring a fallen child's pet. It was the final act of the child themselves, using their last reserves of energy to ensure that their beloved companion would be properly prepared for the journey beyond death. Krog felt his warrior's heart breaking as he understood the full scope of the young one's courage. Here was a fighter who had faced the ultimate test not in battle against external enemies, but in the quiet heroism of ensuring that love transcended the boundaries of mortal existence. "Child died as true warrior," he said, his deep voice thick with emotion that he rarely allowed others to witness. "Not in heat of battle, but in sacred work of protecting what mattered most." Such courage deserves place in highest hunting grounds, where spirits of greatest fighters gather to share stories of valor. Nara, as keeper of their spiritual traditions, began to understand that their ceremony had accomplished more than they had intended. They had not merely honored the dead, they had become witnesses to a story of love and sacrifice that would reshape their understanding of what it meant to be human in a world that seemed designed to punish such sentiments. "Child teaches us truth we had forgotten," the old firekeeper said, her ancient voice carrying new strength drawn from spiritual revelation. "Love is not weakness to be hidden when survival calls. Love is the strength that makes survival worth the struggle, the force that separates us from beasts who know only hunger and fear." Shadow, throughout these revelations, had moved closer to the burial site, his powerful frame now relaxed and peaceful for the first time since they had discovered the sacred grave. The wolf dog's earlier agitation had been replaced by a profound calm that suggested his spiritual distress had been resolved through their act of remembrance and recognition. The presence of the spirit visitors began to intensify as the ceremony reached its emotional peak. The aurora overhead pulsed with rhythms that seemed to match the beating of their hearts, and the sacred fire flared with colors that had no earthly source. In that moment of perfect spiritual connection, each band member felt touched by the gratitude of souls who had waited long seasons for someone to understand and honor their sacrifice. The child spirit seemed to move among them like a gentle breeze, touching each person with the kind of innocent love that had motivated their final act of devotion. The sacred companion's presence was felt as warmth that had nothing to do with their physical fire, a comfort that spoke of loyalty extending beyond the grave. As the spiritual visitation reached its climax, the band understood that they had been changed by their encounter with such pure love. They had discovered something within themselves that they had not known existed, the capacity to honor bonds that transcended practical consideration, to choose reverence over survival when the deepest values were at stake. As the spiritual visitation began to fade, and the aurora slowly dimmed in the pre-dawn sky, the harsh reality of their situation reasserted itself with brutal clarity. The sacred fire that had sustained their ceremony was burning dangerously low, consuming the last of their precious fuel reserves. The bitter cold that had been held at bay by spiritual warmth now crept back into their bones with relentless persistence, reminding them that choosing honor over survival carried consequences that could not be ignored. Mira, was the first to feel the deadly chill reclaiming her infant daughter. The small child, who had remained remarkably quiet during the ceremony as if sensing the sacred nature of their work, now began to emit the weak, thread-like cries that every parent feared. Her tiny lips had taken on the blue tinge that warned of the body's losing battle against the killing frost, and her small limbs moved with the sluggish motions that preceded the final surrender to cold. "Little one fades," Mira whispered, her voice breaking with terror as she pressed her daughter closer to her chest, desperately trying to share what little warmth remained in her own body. "Sacred work honored the dead, but may have cost the living more than we could afford to give." The solitary mother's words struck the band like physical blows, forcing them to confront the terrible mathematics of survival that governed their existence. They had spent precious hours and irreplaceable resources on ceremony, while the relentless cold continued its assault on their most vulnerable member. The choice between spiritual obligation and practical necessity had seemed clear in the heat of sacred fire, but now the consequences demanded payment in the currency of innocent life. Krog felt the weight of leadership pressing down upon his massive shoulders like the burden of carrying a fallen mammoth. The alpha male's decision to honor the lost child had been made with full knowledge of the risks, but seeing those risks manifest in the weakening cries of Mira's infant filled him with a devastating sense of responsibility. His powerful hands clenched and unclenched as he wrestled with the possibility that his choice might have doomed the very life they had sworn to protect. "Leader's burden grows heavy when honor demands prices that innocence must pay," he rumbled, his deep voice thick with self-recrimination. "Sacred work pleased the spirits, but spirits do not breathe air that burns lungs or feel cold that stops hearts from beating." Nara, keeper of their traditions and guardian of wisdom earned through countless seasons, understood better than any of them the delicate balance between spiritual obligation and practical survival. The old firekeeper's weathered face reflected the dying flames as she contemplated the terrible irony of their situation. They had honored love and sacrifice only to discover that their own choices might result in the kind of loss they had sought to memorialize. "Ancient teachings speak of prices that must be paid when worlds of spirit and flesh intersect," she said, her voice carrying the authority of one who had witnessed such conflicts before. "Sacred work always costs more than expected, but abandoning sacred work costs the soul in ways that make survival meaningless." Her words offered little comfort but much truth. The firekeeper understood that they had been caught in one of those impossible situations where every choice carried devastating consequences, where the very values that made them human created conflicts that could only be resolved through sacrifice. Thak, despite his youth, felt the crushing responsibility of being the band's primary forager during their most desperate hour. The young man's knowledge of edible plants and emergency food sources had sustained them through previous crises, but winter's grip had transformed the landscape into a barren wasteland where even his skills seemed inadequate to their needs. "Gathered all that could be found before ceremony," he reported, his voice tight with anxiety as he took inventory of their remaining supplies. "Dried berries almost gone. Cached meat will last maybe 2 days if carefully rationed. Storm coming from north. Can smell it in wind that carries snow and ice and death." The young forager's assessment painted a picture of resources stretched beyond their limits at the worst possible time. They had invested their reserves in honoring the dead when survival demanded they hoard every scrap for the living. The approaching storm that Thak's sensitive nose detected would make travel impossible and increase their caloric needs precisely when their ability to meet those needs had been compromised. Grok, fighting through constant pain from his injuries, forced himself to think tactically about their deteriorating situation. The wounded hunter's experience in desperate circumstances told him that they were approaching the point where difficult decisions about triage and resource allocation could no longer be avoided. "Wounded hunter knows truth others fear to speak," he said through gritted teeth, each word costing him precious energy. "Band cannot carry all members through crisis that comes. Must choose who has strength to survive, who sacrifices so others might live." His words created a silence more profound than the pre-dawn stillness that surrounded them. Every member of the band understood the implications of what he was suggesting, the terrible calculus of survival that sometimes demanded the abandonment of the weak to preserve the strong. It was a reality that haunted every group that faced starvation, cold, or overwhelming odds. Shadow, their faithful wolf-dog companion, seemed to sense the desperation that gripped his human family. The powerful animal moved restlessly around their dying fire, his yellow eyes reflecting an intelligence that understood far more than mere animal instinct should have allowed. His earlier peace from the spiritual visitation had been replaced by a new kind of agitation, the distress of a protector who recognized threats he could not fight. The approaching storm that Thak had detected began to make its presence known through subtle changes in air pressure and wind direction. The aurora that had blessed their ceremony faded completely, leaving them under a star-filled sky that offered beauty but no warmth. The temperature was dropping even further, reaching levels that could kill healthy adults within hours, and would certainly claim any infant who lacked adequate protection. Mira looked around at the faces of her companions, reading in their expressions the same terrible understanding that filled her own heart. The ceremony had been successful in honoring the dead and healing the spiritual wounds that had called to them, but success in the realm of spirit offered no protection against the physical realities that threatened to claim new victims. "Child spirits showed us truth about love lasting beyond death," she said, her voice steady despite the fear that gripped her heart. "Now we must choose if we learned lesson well enough to make same choice unknown child made, protect what matters most, even when cost seems too high to bear." The solitary mother's words crystallized the fundamental challenge they faced. They could attempt to preserve all lives by abandoning their current position and racing toward more sheltered areas, but such flight would mean leaving the sacred burial unguarded and their ceremony incomplete. Alternatively, they could complete their spiritual obligations but risk losing the very innocence they sought to protect. Krog stood slowly, his massive frame rising against the star-filled sky as he prepared to make the decisions that would define their character and determine their fate. The alpha male's face reflected the terrible burden of leadership in a world where every choice carried the potential for devastating loss. "Sacred work not finished until proper farewells spoken and burial blessed for eternal protection," he announced, his voice carrying the finality of absolute command. "We complete what we began, honor the courage that calls to our deepest hearts, but we complete it quickly before cold claims victory over love." His decision committed them to a race against time and temperature, a desperate attempt to fulfill their spiritual obligations before the physical world exacted its full price for their choice to value honor above mere survival. The next few hours would determine whether their act of remembrance became a celebration of love's triumph over death or a tragic repetition of the very loss they had sought to memorialize. With the terrible certainty of death approaching on frozen winds, the band moved with desperate efficiency to complete their sacred obligations before the coming storm could claim new victims. Krog's massive hands worked with surprising gentleness as he helped Nara gather the remaining ceremonial elements, understanding that every moment of delay brought them closer to the point where survival would no longer be possible. Nara, despite her advanced age and the bone-deep cold that threatened to lock her joints in permanent stillness, summoned reserves of strength that seemed to flow from her connection to the spiritual forces they had awakened. The old firekeeper's weathered fingers moved with practiced precision as she prepared the final blessing that would seal their ceremony and provide eternal protection for the sacred burial. "Ancient words must be spoken correctly," she said, her voice gaining power despite the brutal conditions that sapped energy from younger members of the band. One mistake in sacred language could trap spirits between worlds, leave them wandering without peace for all eternity. The firekeeper began to chant in the oldest tongue known to their people, words that had been passed down through countless generations of spiritual guardians who understood the delicate mechanics of communicating with forces beyond physical existence. Her voice rose and fell in patterns that seemed to resonate with the very stones around them, creating harmonies that spoke to something deeper than hearing. Thak, fighting against the numbing cold that threatened to steal feeling from his extremities, worked frantically to create the physical markers that would identify this place as sacred ground for any future travelers who might encounter it. The young forager's fingers, usually so nimble when working with plant materials, moved with clumsy urgency as he arranged stones in patterns that would endure long after their own footprints had been erased by wind and snow. "Future bands must know what rests here," he said through chattering teeth, his breath forming thick clouds that immediately froze into crystalline particles. "Sacred symbols will warn against disturbing the burial, tell story of love that deserved remembering, even when survival called for forgetting." His stone markers, though simple in design, carried the weight of ancient traditions that governed the relationship between the living and the dead. Each carefully placed rock served as both warning and invitation, warning to those who might seek to disturb the burial for material gain, invitation to those who understood the sacred nature of the site to offer their own prayers and remembrances. Mira, despite her growing desperation over her infant daughter's deteriorating condition, found ways to contribute to the final blessing that honored the universal nature of maternal love. The solitary mother unwrapped additional layers from her own clothing, offering them to create a more elaborate covering for the sacred burial, even though such sacrifice left her more vulnerable to the killing cold. Mother Heart recognizes Mother Heart across all barriers, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, as she arranged the soft furs with infinite care. Unknown child's mother would want precious one protected from cold that never ends, wrapped in love that keeps spirit warm even in darkest seasons. Her contribution carried profound significance because it represented the sacrifice of her own protection for the sake of honoring bonds that transcended death. The additional covering she provided would ensure that the sacred burial remained undisturbed by the elements, creating a cocoon of reverence that reflected the depth of care the unknown child had shown their beloved companion. Grok, summoning strength that his wounded body should not have possessed, forced himself to complete the warrior's portion of the blessing ceremony. The injured hunter's voice, damaged by his recent battles with dire wolves, cracked and wavered as he sang the ancient songs that would guide fallen fighters to the far hunting grounds where eternal battles against worthy opponents awaited. Warrior's song carries young fighters' spirit to place of honor among greatest hunters, he chanted, each word extracted at tremendous cost from lungs that struggled against cracked ribs and internal injuries. Child who chose love over safety earns place beside legendary warriors who understood that some things matter more than continued breathing. His battle hymns, normally reserved for fallen members of their own band, took on new meaning when applied to the unknown child whose courage had inspired their dangerous ceremony. The words spoke of valor tested in the crucible of impossible choices, of loyalty that persisted even when hope had died, of love that burned brighter than the fear of extinction. Shadow, their faithful wolf-dog companion, seemed to understand that this was their final opportunity to honor the sacred bonds that had called to them through the winter darkness. The powerful animal positioned himself as a living guardian around the ceremony, his yellow eyes reflecting the dying firelight as he maintained watch against any forces that might interfere with their ritual completion. The approaching storm made its presence increasingly felt through wind gusts that threatened to extinguish their remaining flames and snow flurries that stung exposed skin like countless tiny needles. The temperature continued its relentless drop, reaching levels that made each breath painful and turned exhaled moisture into ice crystals that clung to their primitive clothing. Yet even as the physical world seemed determined to defeat their efforts, the spiritual atmosphere around the burial site intensified rather than diminished. The presence of the child spirit and their sacred companion grew stronger as the ceremony approached completion, as if the approaching storm had thinned the barriers between worlds rather than strengthening them. Krog, feeling the weight of ultimate responsibility for his band's survival, began the final invocation that would seal their blessing and release the spirits to continue their eternal journey. The alpha male's deep voice carried across the frozen landscape like a prayer made audible, calling upon forces older than memory to witness their act of love and remembrance. Unknown child, faithful companion, your courage teaches us truth about bonds that make survival meaningful, he intoned, his words forming clouds of vapor that rose like incense toward the star-filled sky. We who walk the same difficult path offer recognition of your sacrifice, promise to carry forward the lesson of love that chooses honor over safety. As his words reached their crescendo, something extraordinary occurred. The wind that had been building toward storm intensity suddenly stilled to complete calm, creating a pocket of peace around the burial site that defied the meteorological forces gathering strength in the surrounding darkness. The remaining flames of their sacred fire flared with renewed vigor, casting dancing shadows that seemed to celebrate rather than mourn. In that moment of perfect spiritual connection, each band member felt touched by gratitude from souls who had waited long seasons for someone to understand and honor their sacrifice. The child spirit seemed to move among them like a gentle breeze, touching each person with the kind of innocent love that had motivated their final act of devotion. Nara, as keeper of their spiritual traditions, spoke the final words that would complete their ceremony and release them to face whatever consequences their choice had created. The old firekeeper's ancient voice carried new strength, drawn from spiritual connection, as she sealed their blessing with phrases that had been used by countless generations to honor love that transcended death. "Sacred work is finished," she announced, her words carrying the finality of spiritual completion. "Spirits rest in peace, knowing love was witnessed and honored by those who understand its power. Now we carry their story forward, become living testimony to courage that chooses heart over survival." As her words faded into the pre-dawn darkness, the spiritual presences that had blessed their ceremony began to withdraw, leaving behind a sense of completion that transcended their desperate physical circumstances. They had accomplished what they set out to do. They had honored love and sacrifice in a way that gave meaning to the struggles that defined their existence. But even as spiritual satisfaction filled their hearts, the practical reality of their situation demanded immediate attention. The storm that had held back during their ceremony now resumed its approach with doubled intensity, and the precious time they had spent in sacred work had brought them to the very edge of their ability to survive the brutal conditions that awaited. The moment their ceremony concluded, the withheld fury of the approaching storm descended upon them, with the violence of a cornered predator finally released to attack. Wind that had been held at supernatural bay during their sacred work now roared through the stone formation with enough force to knock even Krog's massive frame off balance, carrying with it sheets of snow so dense that visibility disappeared beyond arm's length. The temperature plummeted to levels that made their previous discomfort seem like gentle coolness by comparison. Each breath now brought agony as super-cooled air seared their lungs, and exhaled moisture froze instantly into clouds of ice crystals that clung to their faces like frozen tears. The sacred fire that had sustained their ceremony was extinguished within moments, its flames no match for winds that seemed to carry the very essence of winter's killing power. Mira's infant daughter, already weakened by hours of exposure to brutal conditions, began to emit the thread-thin cries that warned of a small body's final surrender to the cold. The solitary mother pressed her child closer to her chest, wrapping both of them in every available scrap of fur and hide, but she could feel the terrible stillness spreading through the tiny limbs that should have been kicking with vigorous life. "Little one grows quiet," she sobbed, her words torn away by winds that seemed determined to steal even the comfort of spoken prayer. Mother's warmth not enough against cold that kills without mercy, without regard for innocence that deserves protection. The desperate edge in her voice cut through even the howling storm, reaching her companions with the force of absolute terror. Every member of the band understood what her words meant. They were witnessing the approach of the very loss they had sought to honor in their ceremony, watching helplessly as their choice to value spiritual obligation over practical survival claimed its inevitable price. Krog, his leadership tested by conditions that pushed beyond the limits of endurance, fought against the storm's fury to assess their options for shelter. The alpha male's powerful frame, though resistant to cold that would kill smaller individuals, showed signs of the hypothermia that threatened them all. His movements had become slower and more deliberate, his thinking clouded by the gradual shutdown of bodily functions that preceded freezing death. "Cannot reach distant shelters in this storm," he rumbled through lips that had lost much of their flexibility, making speech difficult and painful. "Must find protection here. Use stone formation to shield against wind that carries death on every gust." His assessment was both accurate and terrifying. The storm had reached intensity levels that made travel impossible, even for healthy individuals with full energy reserves. Their band, already weakened by hours of exposure and depleted resources, would face certain death if they attempted to seek shelter elsewhere. Yet their current position offered only marginal protection against elements that seemed determined to punish their choice to honor the dead. Thak, his forager's training including knowledge of emergency shelter construction, began working frantically to create wind barriers, using the available materials around the stone formation. The young man's hands, numbed by cold to the point where fine manipulation became nearly impossible, struggled to weave together branches and animal hides into structures that might deflect the worst of the storm's assault. "Small shelter possible if worked together," he called out over the wind's roar, his voice barely audible despite the desperate volume of his shouts. "Use body heat together. Share warmth like pack animals when death hunts in the darkness." His words offered the slim hope of collective survival through mutual support. the ancient strategy of huddling together to preserve body heat when individual efforts proved inadequate. Yet even this approach carried risks. If the shelter failed or their combined body heat proved insufficient, they would die together, rather than having the possibility of some members surviving to continue their genetic line. Nara, despite her advanced age making her the most vulnerable to cold-related death, somehow found reserves of strength that defied her physical limitations. The old firekeeper's knowledge of survival techniques accumulated over countless harsh seasons allowed her to contribute guidance even as her own body began to shut down in response to life-threatening conditions. Ancient knowledge speaks of snow caves that trap warm air, create pockets of life within killing cold, she said, her words emerging in short gasps as breathing became increasingly difficult. Must dig deep, create chambers that hold heat, like cupped hands hold precious water. Her suggestion offered technical hope, but implementing such construction required energy and time that they might not possess. The storm's intensity continued to increase rather than plateau, suggesting that they faced not merely a severe weather event, but potentially one of those legendary tempests that reshaped landscapes and eliminated entire populations of both animals and humans. Grok, despite his wounds and constant pain, forced himself to contribute what strength remained in his functional arm to the desperate construction effort. The injured hunter understood better than most how quickly death could claim those who relaxed their vigilance even momentarily, and his warrior's mentality refused to surrender even when survival seemed mathematically impossible. Wounded fighter still has value in defense against storm that attacks like pack of dire wolves, he declared through gritted teeth, each word costing precious energy that his damaged body could barely spare. We'll hold position, maintain shelter, protect the helpless until strength fails or dawn brings mercy. His determination to fight even hopeless battles inspired the others to continue their desperate efforts, despite growing evidence that their situation had moved beyond the realm of mere difficulty into the territory of likely catastrophe. The injured hunter's refusal to surrender became a rallying point for collective resistance against forces that seemed determined to prove the futility of their ceremonial choice. Shadow, their faithful wolf-dog companion, demonstrated the survival instincts that had allowed his species to endure in the harshest environments on Earth. The powerful animal used his thick coat and natural understanding of wind patterns to position himself as a living windbreak, his body blocking the worst gusts from reaching the humans who depended on his loyalty for protection. Working together with desperate efficiency, born from absolute necessity, the band managed to create a crude but functional shelter using the natural contours of the stone formation combined with hastily constructed barriers of hide and vegetation. The structure was far from comfortable, barely large enough to contain all 5 humans in cramped proximity, but it offered the possibility of collective survival through shared body heat and mutual protection. As they huddled together in their makeshift refuge, listening to the storm's continued assault on their fragile defenses, each member faced the reality that their choice to honor the dead might yet claim lives among the living. The wind howled through cracks in their shelter, with sounds that seemed almost like voices, whether those of the spirits they had honored, or simply the meaningless fury of uncaring elements, none could say. Mira clutched her infant daughter in the center of their human huddle, feeling the precious warmth of her companions' bodies, fighting against the cold that sought to claim the smallest and most vulnerable among them. The solitary mother's tears froze on her cheeks as she whispered prayers to forces that seemed to have withdrawn their protection now that ceremony had ended, and practical survival demanded precedence. The storm raged through what remained of the night, with undiminished fury, testing not only their physical endurance but their psychological resolve to continue believing that their choice to honor love and sacrifice had been worth the terrible price it now demanded. In the darkness of their shelter, pressed together like the last survivors of a dying world, they waited to learn whether their act of remembrance would become a celebration of values that transcended mere survival, or simply another tragedy to be discovered by future travelers who might wonder why anyone would choose death over the abandonment of sacred obligations. The longest night any of them had ever endured finally began to surrender to the first pale hints of dawn creeping across the eastern horizon. The storm that had raged with supernatural fury throughout the dark hours slowly exhausted itself, its howling winds diminishing to occasional gusts that no longer threatened to tear apart their fragile shelter. As grey light filtered through the cracks in their makeshift refuge, The band members stirred from the half-conscious state that had been their only defense against hypothermia's final embrace. Mira was the first to fully awaken, her maternal instincts demanding immediate assessment of her infant daughter's condition. With trembling hands that barely responded to her will, she checked for the vital signs that would tell her whether their night of desperate survival had claimed its smallest victim. For terrifying moments that stretched like eternities, she felt nothing. No breath, no heartbeat, no warmth that spoke of continued life. Then, miraculously, she detected the faint but steady rhythm of a heart still beating against impossible odds. Her daughter's breathing was shallow and irregular, her small body dangerously cold, but the spark of life persisted with the stubborn determination that characterized all survivors. Tears of relief froze on Mira's cheeks as she pressed her child closer, sharing what little warmth her own body could provide. "Little one lives," she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion that encompassed both profound gratitude and continuing terror. Spirit stronger than winter's killing breath, love more powerful than storm that sought to claim innocence for the darkness. Her words stirred the others from their own struggles against cold-induced lethargy. Krog lifted his massive head, fighting against muscles that had stiffened during the night, into positions that spoke of his body's desperate attempts to conserve core temperature. The alpha male's movements were slow and deliberate, each motion carefully calculated to avoid triggering the collapse that exhaustion threatened to bring. "Band survives another test," he rumbled, his deep voice carrying satisfaction despite the obvious toll the night had taken on his powerful frame. "Sacred work honored, spiritual obligations fulfilled, and still we breathe air that burns but sustains life." The pride in his voice reflected more than mere survival. It spoke to their collective achievement in maintaining their humanity, even when choosing compassion over practical wisdom. They had faced the ultimate test of values under pressure and emerged with their capacity for love intact, proving that the bonds they cherished could indeed transcend the brutal mathematics of survival. Nara, despite her advanced age making her the most vulnerable to the cold's assault, showed remarkable resilience as consciousness returned. The old firekeeper's weathered face bore the marks of their ordeal, frostbite traces that would leave permanent reminders of this night, but her ancient eyes still carried the spark of spiritual understanding that made her the keeper of their traditions. "Fire spirits protected us through darkness that sought to steal warmth from hearts as well as bodies," she said, her voice gaining strength as circulation slowly returned to extremities that had nearly surrendered to the killing cold. "Sacred ceremony created shields of protection that physical eyes cannot see but desperate souls feel as salvation." Her interpretation of their survival carried weight that went beyond mere gratitude for luck. The firekeeper's understanding of spiritual forces suggested that their choice to honor the dead had indeed created protective influences that helped them endure conditions that should have claimed multiple lives. Thak, his young body's natural resilience, allowing faster recovery than his older companions, began the careful process of assessing their physical condition and remaining resources. The young forager's movements were stiff and painful, but his mind remained sharp enough to calculate what they would need for continued survival now that the immediate crisis had passed. "Storm took much but left us breathing," he reported, his voice carrying the practical optimism that had made him invaluable during previous emergencies. "Shelter held, saved just enough warmth to keep spirits anchored in flesh that wanted to surrender to endless sleep." His assessment revealed that while they had survived the night, their situation remained precarious. The storm had scattered much of their remaining supplies, and their energy reserves had been depleted to dangerous levels. Recovery would require careful management of resources and gradual restoration of strength before they could attempt to reach more permanent shelter. Grok, the wounded hunter whose injuries had made him the most likely casualty of their ordeal, surprised everyone by demonstrating that warrior determination could triumph over physical limitations that seemed insurmountable. His damaged body had somehow found reserves of endurance that defied medical understanding, sustained by the spiritual strength that came from knowing he had participated in something sacred. "Wounded warrior carries new scars, but old courage burns undimmed," he declared, his voice stronger than it had been in days despite the obvious toll of their survival struggle. "Battle against storm fought with honor, victory earned through bonds that make individuals into something greater than sum of separate parts." His words captured the transformation that had occurred during their ordeal. They were no longer simply 5 individuals and a wolf dog struggling against hostile elements. They had become a unified force, held together by shared values that proved stronger than the fears that might have divided them. Shadow, their faithful companion whose distress had originally led them to discover the sacred burial, now showed signs of profound peace that had been absent since their arrival at the stone formation. The wolf dog's earlier agitation had been completely resolved through their ceremony and subsequent ordeal, leaving him calm and content in a way that suggested spiritual healing had accompanied their physical survival. As full daylight revealed the aftermath of the storm, the band could see that their choice to stay and honor the dead had indeed carried a terrible price. The landscape around them bore the scars of wind and ice that could have easily claimed their lives, and their own bodies showed the marks of their struggle against elements that respected no bonds of loyalty or love. Yet they had emerged with something more valuable than mere continued existence. They had proven to themselves, and to whatever forces governed their harsh world, that the capacity for reverence and sacrifice that defined their humanity could survive even the most brutal tests. The unknown child's lesson about choosing love over safety had been learned not through abstract understanding, but through lived experience that changed them at the deepest level. As they prepared to leave the stone formation and continue their journey toward more permanent shelter, each member of the band carried with them the knowledge that they had participated in something sacred, a ceremony that honored the bonds making survival meaningful rather than merely possible. The sacred burial would remain protected by the markers they had created, its story preserved in their memories, to be shared with future generations who needed to understand the power of love that transcended death. Mira looked back one final time at the carefully arranged stones that marked the resting place of the unknown child and their beloved companion. Her infant daughter, growing stronger as warmth returned to her small body, would someday hear the story of this night, would learn that her own survival had been possible because strangers chose to honor bonds that connected all living things in networks of care and devotion. "Sacred spirits rest in peace, knowing love was witnessed and remembered," she whispered, her words carrying across the morning air like a final prayer. Story travels with us now, becomes part of who we are and what we teach those who come after. As the small band began their journey away from the stone formation, Shadow leading the way with renewed purpose, they carried with them more than the memory of a successful ceremony. They had discovered within themselves the capacity to choose compassion over convenience, to honor the sacred bonds that made their harsh existence meaningful despite its inevitable conclusion in death. The sun rose higher, warming air that had nearly stolen their breath, melting ice that had threatened to claim their lives. Behind them, the stone formation stood as a monument, not only to the love of an unknown child for their sacred companion, but to the enduring power of hearts that chose remembrance over forgetting, honor over safety, love over the cold calculation of mere survival. Their howling wolf dog no longer mourned for the restless dead. He sang now of life continued, of bonds honored, of love that proved stronger than winter's killing breath. The sacred burial had found its proper guardians in those who understood that some things mattered more than breathing, and their story would live on in the memories of survivors who had learned that choosing love always cost more than expected, but always proved worth the price demanded by a world that tested every value against the ultimate measure of mortality.